So first off, I want to thank everyone for joining us. It's inspiring to see so many supporters coming together today. We are honored to be here. I'm honored to be here as your moderator for Habitat for Humanity, Seattle King County's very important discussion. I'm Tracey Leong, morning anchor for KIRO 7, and I'll be hosting today's Women Build panel. The panel is part of Women Build Week, which brings women from all walks of life together to address the housing crisis facing thousands of women and children in our region. Women Build Week helps fund critical projects, build homes, and revitalize neighborhoods working side by side with Habitat's homeowners and volunteers. Habitat for Humanity is a global organization that advocates with governments around the world in support of housing affordability and access for all to have safe, decent, and affordable housing. Locally, Habitat Seattle King County brings people together as a community to build and create strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. Now, I'm very excited to introduce you to our panel. So let's get started. We have Mia Gregerson, State Representative for the 33rd Legislative District of Washington. Welcome. Hello. We have Lynn Robinson, Mayor of Bellevue. We have Patience Malaba, Director of Government Relations and Policy, Housing Development Consortium. Hello. We have Erica Barnett, editor and publisher at PubliCola and author of Quitter, a memoir of drinking, relapse, and recovery. And we have Laura Clise, founder, CEO of Intentionlist, social entrepreneur, sustainability leader, and CSR strategist. Okay, and due to unforeseen circumstances, unfortunately, Teresa Mosqueda, council member from Seattle, will no longer be joining us. So we do want to give a warm welcome to our panelists today and to thank everyone who's joining us as well virtually. Our group will be taking questions directly from the audience later in the hour, so please drop your comments and questions in the Q&A box. It's right at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse over it, you'll see a little Q&A box and you can type in your questions and we can answer them later on if we have time. Today, we are here to talk about women, housing, and the impact of COVID-19. Women are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're also disproportionately bearing the cost of the economic downturn. The financial fallout from the coronavirus crisis is concentrated among certain groups like minorities, lower earners, and women. COVID-19 has exacerbated housing instability at a time when staying home has become the first line of defense against the virus. Women in Washington are more at risk of being in or falling into poverty. The economic downturn associated with the pandemic made women and women of color even more vulnerable to financial instability. With higher rates of poverty, a persistent wage gap, and continuing concerns around unemployment, the current crisis is shining a bright light on the underlying financial insecurity and housing instability of women in our communities. So thank you all. And we will begin with the topic now of women and COVID-19. Women are finding themselves on the front lines of the pandemic while also juggling careers, family obligations, and of course, so much more. And as panelists, we all know that we juggled quite a bit before the pandemic and well, even now more during the pandemic. So I'll start with Mayor Robinson. What role do you think safe and affordable housing plays in supporting women during the pandemic?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and for everybody who's participating. This is such an important topic right now, so it's great to be sitting here discussing it. I think, whether it's during the pandemic or not, safe and stable housing is just a fundamental need. You cannot think clearly, sleep well, you can't do your best work, and if you do not have safe and stable housing. And for women trying to raise a family, the studies have shown that the biggest deterrent to early childhood learning is stress. And the biggest stress in a child's life is unstable housing. So the job of raising a child in this environment is doubly difficult. Lack of affordable housing choices often means that women are living far from where they work. And we already know that a commute longer than 15 minutes cuts into quality of life. You add to that the drive to and from childcare, and you've lost a significant amount of your quality time. Women represent 66% of low-wage workforce, and more than 3 out of 4 single parent households are headed by women. And yet a large percentage of job loss during COVID were women employees. So you add to that now the wage gap. And so for a single mom who cannot take on multiple jobs to make ends meet, finding a home she can afford on limited wages is next to impossible. Safe and affordable housing provides stability to individuals and families, and having more affordable housing stock means more stability and more choices, including the choice to live closer to work.
Thank you. Our next question is for Laura Clise. What about the pandemic's impact on women-owned businesses?
Oh my goodness, Tracy, how long do you have?
I know.
So let's think about a time not so long ago when nail salons and barber shops and boutiques and dry cleaners and gyms and non-essential businesses had to close completely. Think about everything that you've read about the challenges that small business owners have had to face over the last year. Next, think about everything you know, have heard, have read about the pandemic's impact on women as parents and as caregivers. Now add the two together and multiply by the fact that women are oftentimes the mom figures in our communities, and then raise that to the power of the disproportionate impact 2020 had on women of color. I think that a critical question for all of us to ask ourselves is, what will we do? How will we spend like it matters? How will we vote with our dollars to ensure that we lift up the women-owned businesses in our communities today and in the weeks and months ahead?
Thank you for both of your answers. They were a lot for us to think about, especially as we're on this road to recovery and we're all thinking of this as we move forward. More than 60% of all Habitat homeowners are women head of households in the US. And we know that housing insecurity and affordability in the US has been a challenge for women, especially for women of color. Nearly 1 in 3 single mothers live below the poverty line, and 60% of impoverished children live in households headed by women. This was a very deep concern pre-pandemic, as we saw, and now we're in the midst of the pandemic and hopefully coming out of it. Over the past year, women have been called to serve, and they continue to serve on the front lines of the pandemic that we've seen. So while COVID-19 has adversely impacted everyone, the economic fallout has been disproportionately felt by women. So the first question is for Patience Malapa. What are your perspectives on how the pandemic has revealed and changed the status of women?
Well, Tracy, thanks for that question. I think the pandemic has created what I prefer to call a she-cession, which is a recession that is disproportionately impacting women. And it is going to widen the gender gap. It is also going to widen the racial gap. It's going to undo quite a number of wins that we've seen over the last decades in working towards gender equity. I say that because economic issues and women issues to me are the same. And the effect of the pandemic so far has been felt worst by women, especially women of color. When you look at job losses, some of you may have seen the New York Times report in January, where there was an analysis of jobs that were lost just in December. About 156,000 jobs were lost across the nation by women. And in that same period, men gained 16,000 new jobs. And that's a big problem on the part of women, because when you look at the sectors that were being impacted, is the sectors where you predominantly have women working in those sectors. You have the education sector, you have the hospitality industry, you have the service industry where you have more women. And that's a bigger problem when you combine that with the crises that we're already dealing with. We already have a housing crisis, an exacerbated one for that matter. We have a disproportionate share of unpaid work that has to be done by women, with children being at home and homeschooling and women having to bear a lot of that work. So overall, what does it do to the status of women? I think it deepens pre-existing inequities that we already knew, and for a very long time, we've ignored as a society. And when you look closer at the numbers in terms of how these disproportionalities are showing up, and you look at the numbers of people who are behind in rent across the Washington state here, we have about 225,000 people who are behind in rent. And when you look closer at those numbers, it's mostly BIPOC households, but disproportionately it's also women headed households. So that is a huge problem that we do need to be proactively thinking of. How do we make sure that this is just a loss while we're in the pandemic, but it's not a generational loss. We're not going back on some of the efforts that we've gained over the past few years. So it's a responsibility that government has, a responsibility that sectors across nonprofits and the private sector have to really support and make sure we come out of this pandemic in an equitable manner, centering on the people who are most impacted, like women.
Patience, thank you. Our next question is for Representative Gregerson. What are the top 2 COVID-related issues concerning housing that you hear about from your constituents in Washington?
Yeah, thank you, Tracey, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. The top 2 are very easy for me. One is the uncertainty of whether or not the eviction moratorium will end and when it would end. And I'm thinking about the last 12 months and the roller coaster of executive orders and not knowing really what month to month is going to happen. And I think a good example of that are a mobile home park that was scheduled to close, but with the eviction moratorium, it allowed mothers and families to stay where they were for months to be able to continue to look and find a home. And in that journey, about 95% of them lost their job due to COVID because most of them are working either for the airport related industry or other essential type work. And with that, they were trying to purchase a home because they were moving from a mobile home and they needed to increase their credit score. So navigating these systems, whether it's the financial institutions, working with teachers to be able to move their children and be able to continue to learn remote. Those are big issues that kept coming forward over and over again, is how do we navigate these complicated systems when you're alone at home? The other is the uncertainty and the trauma and the shame that comes with COVID when it comes to needing help for the first time if you're an elder and needing to access food resources. We knew we were going to have up to 2 million people around Washington state needing help with making sure they're keeping food on the table. And that burden fell on the shoulders of so many of our women. And they had to choose between their homes, home security and food, remote learning, getting themselves to work, and of course, childcare. So I know that's not an easy answer, but those are all intertwined. And that's how our women get up and go to sleep at night, trying to figure out how to navigate each day. And our offices definitely heard all of these different pleas for help.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a lot of complications just added, with COVID related, staying home, school. So a lot of deep issues there. Thank you. Erica Barnett, this next question is for you. Women are more vulnerable to COVID-19 related economic effects because of existing gender inequalities. What measures should policy and business leaders consider?
Thank you for that question. I think that some of the answers are obvious and have been known for a long time. For women with children, universal access to childcare and flexible working conditions are really critical. Particularly, I think COVID really exposed how hard it is for women who are already balancing so many things to bring in, the additional challenges of childcare and working from home if people are, fortunate enough to keep their jobs. And as Patience mentioned, this pandemic has just been so disproportionate on women, and particularly women of color. I think that in terms of policy, one thing that, government can support childcare, by funding childcare, by encouraging flexible work hours, and by adopting legislation that requires, at the very least, pay transparency, because pay inequality has only gotten worse And this is another thing, like everything COVID has exacerbated, it's exacerbated that fault line between men and women. And pay transparency is something that the city of Seattle has worked on, and that I think, there's a lot more progress that could be made in that area. I think one issue that that housing providers can actually, deal with, and this may be a legislative, something that has to be legislated as well, but women are a lot more likely to have low credit scores, to have lower incomes because of that pay gap. And it's really important for housing providers not to be able to discriminate on the basis of things like credit scores and on the basis of, requiring an unreasonable amount of income for an apartment that, a woman would otherwise be able to afford, particularly single mothers. That those things can all be barriers to housing. And if you're less likely to qualify for high quality housing, you're going to end up in, in substandard housing or housing situations that make you vulnerable to health problems, predation by landlords, and all sorts of other things that can just really diminish women's quality of life. So those are some of the solutions that, that come to mind. I mean, there's so many more, but I'll just leave it at those few.
Erica, thank you. Yes, there's a long list. I know there are plenty that we could talk about, so thank you. We are going to move on now to housing and the COVID-19 crisis. Housing affordability had been decreasing in this country, both for homeowners and renters since the 1970s, but it has accelerated since 2000, with housing costs increasing much, much faster than incomes, such that in 2019, before COVID-19, 37 million households were paying more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgages. And among renters, it was about half. And we know that those burdens are higher among households of color. And for today's conversation, the National Equity Atlas has estimated that Black and Latinx women renters have the highest burden across all households. Our first question is for patients. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted housing, and how will housing be critical to the recovery?
Thank you, Tracey, for that question. I think it's really the question of our moment, and asking ourselves what we can do about what we find ourselves to be in with this exacerbated crisis. So before the onset of the pandemic, we were, of course, in a booming economy and most of our cities were doing great, but we were in a housing crisis. And now, with it being exacerbated, really the people who are most vulnerable are the lowest income people and people who are women or lower income families. The shortage that we were seeing in King County specifically, we were required to produce about 44,000 homes every 5 years, just to make sure that people who are lower income are not paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And now that has been further exacerbated. If you look at the National Low Income Housing Coalition numbers from the national level, looking at what we see here locally, there's only 32 available and affordable homes for people who are lower income, for about 100 households who are lower income at the 0 to 30% area median income. And yet within the same period of time that you mentioned in the decade, we were also losing a net unit of housing that has been affordable to people who are in those lower income range. We have seen about 112,000 units that we've lost over time, mostly due to rent increases, not so much due to demolition. And how is this showing up today? I mentioned earlier, we have people who are behind in their rent, 225,000 households who are falling behind in their rent. And we're going to need more rental assistance to help them feel certain during that time. We're going to need the protections that were passed at the state level to ensure that they're able to stay stably housed, because they're having to trade off between paying their rent or buying food or taking care of their children, which is such a difficult time. And when you ask the question of where does housing play a role in the recovery, I would say it's really at the core. of helping people find themselves to have a home that is healthy, a home that they can stay in and find themselves with their families, and in a community where they can have access to open space, they can have access to amenities nearby. And that's not always an opportunity that many families do have. And I think at the core of looking at those who are most impacted and centering them in giving those housing opportunities, it's important that we also look at racial equity. Think about where we've come from, the history that has led us to where we are today in terms of some of the housing inequities that we see. They've come from a history of segregation, they've come from a history of redlining. How do we, as we think of recovery, really center those goals of redressing the past harms, but also making sure that people who are most impacted are being centered in the process.
Thank you. Laura, the next question is for you. What policies must be changed to ensure that more families have access to housing communities that are inviting for all, and how can the business community help out?
So the truth, of course, is that we could have a multi-day symposium on the topic of access to affordable housing, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods. I think that we also know that conversations and policies around affordable housing and more inclusive, equitable economic development go hand in hand. And so that said, I'd like to make a few points. One is that I think we need to continue to be creative in the way that we approach affordable housing and inclusive economic development. I think of a project like the Liberty Bank building, the Africatown Community Land Trust, and we need to look at the role that community ownership plays in facilitating the kind of development that I think we all would like to see more of. You know, I think about on the small business side, what the Liberty Bank building has meant bringing back Black business to the Central District. Restaurants like Communion, Cafe Avol is going to have their second location there. And so I would point to that as an example that gives me hope, but certainly an example that I would love to see more of. At the same time, another project I would point to is the Vulcan Jackson Apartments project at 23rd and South Jackson Street. It has been great to see, again, the blending of access to affordable housing, Section 8 housing, with the intentionally holding space for Black-owned businesses like Queen Care, like Simply Soulful, which will be moving from their Madison Park location. And I think that the common denominator here is creativity, right? And then being intentional, you know, not just allowing the systems and the market and cultural forces to play out as they are, but to instead think about what the outcomes are that we want, that we insist upon, and then put our creative thinking to work. In addition to that, of course, organizations like Habitat play an important role as we're navigating creative solutions and how it is, especially that we can start to engage even more of the business community and being part of the solution. And then the final thing that I will say is I think the business community, especially larger corporations, and we've started to see more of this over the past year, really need to recognize and understand the full value of Main Street small businesses in our communities. Above and beyond the products and services for sale, we need corporations to recognize that these small businesses, neighborhood hubs, the places that hold space for us to connect with and come together and build community, are absolutely critical pillars to the kind of city and neighborhoods we want to live and work in.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, a lot of working collectively together to move forward. And Erica, the next question is for you. You wrote a book about addiction and recovery and access to housing playing a big part in your personal story. What perspective do you have on the importance of housing, And what does housing impact, or how does housing impact the success of recovery and mental health for women in general?
Thanks for that question. I should say first, being evicted or threatened with eviction is just bad for your health in general, and particularly for mental health. Women who are evicted or, at risk of eviction are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, all sorts of other negative health impacts that can just affect your entire life than other folks. And so that's just kind of the baseline of the impact of mental health, of lack of housing or lack of access to stable housing on mental health. For recovery, one of the things that I learned in trying to sort of build a new life for myself as a person in recovery, I wanted to go into sober housing initially. And what I discovered is that it's functionally non-existent for women in the Seattle area. And and this applies generally too. So I was looking at Oxford houses, which is a type of recovery housing that is very successful, has a really good track record. And there were, something like 20, 24 for men and only a handful for women. Something like 25 spots in the whole city. And so it isn't the case that men are just more likely to suffer from addiction or seek treatment for it. It's that the safety net for people with mental illness and addiction is largely a safety net for men. So we really need to build out that safety net. In addition, for housing that's specifically for, domestic violence victims, which is badly, badly needed. We need housing and treatment that's geared specifically for women, towards women, including single women and women with children, because housing provides a refuge that makes sobriety possible. I cover homelessness as part of my job, and one of the things that I hear over and over is that, these are intersecting crises. And homelessness makes people more likely to use drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. And housing makes it possible for people to use less or stop using and deal with their mental health problems. And I certainly found that true for myself. I was very fortunate. I didn't, as I said, I really wanted to go into sober housing. It didn't end up being an option because there just wasn't any available. But I was very privileged and I had the ability to go back to my apartment and, and even though I didn't have a job at the time and I didn't have a lot of supports, I had, family support. So that is a bit of luck that I had that a lot of women don't have. And so it causes them to stay in situations where they're living with, their abuser or their drug dealer or somebody who's using around them. And that makes sobriety very, very difficult. So I think we have to think of these as interconnecting crises and interconnecting solutions. So that, we think of housing as part of an integral to recovery, whether it's recovery from addiction or from mental health issues that require stable treatment and medication every day and just the stability that housing provides.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. Thank you for sharing that. Nationally, communities of color were among the most vulnerable groups of our population long before COVID-19 hit, with African Americans and Hispanics accounting for 21% and 17% of COVID cases, respectively. Decades-long barriers such as inadequate access to healthcare, higher incidence of pre-existing health conditions, and housing disparities have contributed to a higher risk of death from infections. What steps can we take to rectify this disparity for housing accessibility, especially for vulnerable groups? Would any of our panelists, we'd like to open it up, like to take the lead in answering this question?
Sure, I can take the lead.
Thank you.
All right. I think the first step, especially thinking of where we are right now, that's really crucial is to remedy and prevent the potential mass eviction so making sure that people are, number one, protected by policies to keep them stably housed in their homes. Secondly, making available the funding for them to not be required to have to pay money that they actually do not have. So rental assistance is going to be key. But for homeowners as well, foreclosure support, whether that's in the form of counseling, that's in the form of funding, really helping some of our homeowners who will also be struggling is another big area. But beyond that long term, I think as we are looking at our communities and cities in terms of regulations, and we'll talk about this a little later in terms of some of the local opportunities we see, but using regulations and incentivizing opportunities for people who have for a long time been marginalized is going to be key. Thinking of increasing home ownership opportunities for communities that historically have not had the access or opportunity to be able to build wealth through home ownership is another aspect, and supporting, of course, rental assistance, supporting rental housing development is another bigger goal to support.
Yes, thank you, Patience. Yes, Mayor Robinson.
Well, this does not speak to people of color, but the diversity of abilities. We know that most of the women who are homeless are older than 60 and disabled. So as you're creating affordable housing, trying to house that population, how many of the units that you're creating are going to be accessible to that population? So I think it's really important that we remember we have to include universal design in all of our affordable housing units so that everybody, there's a large pool for these people to choose from when their opportunity arises.
Absolutely. And would anyone else like to also answer as well? Oh, yes, Representative.
Thank you, Tracey. And I'll just try to build off of some of the comments that have already been made. We know that relying on each jurisdiction to take on a number of affordable or attainable housing units is not working. We need a more strategic approach that's through policy that's going to ensure that we can build the missing middle and that everyone is able to participate in this. Policy is really incredibly important at this time. While we know it's billions of dollars to create or to build the number of affordable housing units that we need, we actually need the policy that's going to back that up so that we can ensure that the financial institutions know exactly how to support the community where they are. Communities of low income can come together to be able to access dollars so they can purchase these properties. It's no longer one family, one property. It's communities of people needing to be able to access these systems. And until we do it through policy, we're not going to really change the landscape very much. And I think this is a moment in time I'm hopeful that we can make those changes.
Thank you. Would Erica or Laura, or would you like to answer, or we could always?
I guess the only comment that I would make, which is less a housing policy comment and more speaks to, I think, the fact that we can't just talk about housing affordability, you know, in its own silo, because so many things are interconnected. And when I think, for example, about just the number of conversations I've had with small business owners, immigrant, POC small business owners over the past year, who through no fault of their own have seen a generation of financial stability evaporate seemingly overnight. And the risk that that puts not just their visions and hopes for the transfer of intergenerational wealth, but just survival of their business. I think that it's important for us to continue to look not only at how we provide additional access to housing, but also how we continue to support people like small business owners whose business is their means through which they maintain their housing security for themselves and their families.
And I would just add, you know, I think that, you know, it starts with a recognition that women in this country in particular have different challenges and have different needs than men do. You know, and I'm including, you know, women inclusive of all women. And, and I think that the pandemic has really shown us that women's unequal household burdens make us especially vulnerable to, job loss, to mental health challenges, to substance abuse. And there's an idea that like, if we sort of lift all boats, meaning men's boats, typically, that women will be just fine. And there's a sense that women are somehow self-sufficient on our own. And I think, being able to say, no, women actually do have specific challenges and specific unmet needs that need to be addressed in a different way than men's. I mean, issues like childcare, like equal pay, like the access to free or affordable mental health care, like access to credit. I think that is kind of the starting place for actually rebalancing this, not just the housing situation, but just the lack of equality that has been exacerbated during the pandemic.
Erica, thank you. And as all the panelists highlighted, it is really, all women right now, especially, do need our support. And we do want to take a look now at a success story of one such Wonder Woman and Habitat homeowner, Siobhan Jones. And so we can share this story with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to share my story with you. You have made such a life-changing difference for my family through your support for Habitat for Humanity. I am Siobhan Jones, and I am a very proud, very grateful Habitat homeowner. For the past few years, up until last month, my 5 children and I were living in a 2-bedroom apartment. 6 of us sharing just a small space with just 1 bathroom. So just imagine that. Considering that 4 of my children are teenagers, and at this time in their development when they really needed privacy, there was simply none that I, as a single mom, could offer them, and it broke my heart. My children range in age from 18 all the way down to 9 months, and we have been on a pretty difficult journey. I've experienced homelessness as a child, so I know what that feels like, and I didn't want that for my children. I've worked hard to give them a better life, and in between having my older children and the younger 2, I went back to school to study social work and behavioral science, where I graduated last year with a bachelor's degree in behavioral science. I also started working as a housing case manager for Solid Ground, which assists those living in poverty with social services, and I still work there today. So from both a personal and a professional perspective, I understand the inherent challenges facing those in need related to our region's homeless crisis and the lack of affordable housing. Things were going pretty well. We were living in a bigger home in the Kent area, and as a result of a pretty bad relationship, I had to take the kids and leave our house. But because the cost of rent was so high, we had to move to the outskirts of Maple Valley, and just so that I could afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Not only did the kids have to change their schools and leave their friends, it made my commute even longer. And then there was a living situation. We were literally living on top of each other. My bed was in the living room, and the kids had their room, so I wanted them to have their space so that they can share the 2 rooms between them. But it was then that I started to think seriously about Habitat. The living situation and the location in Maple Valley was not a great fit for us. I felt horrible telling my kids that I couldn't afford to buy or even rent something larger. And as a parent, I felt a responsibility to do better by them. So I went onto Habitat's website and I added my name. And I remember my older kids being very skeptical about Habitat. I think they were afraid to hope, and I was too. But Habitat didn't let us down. We closed on our 5-bedroom, 2-bath home in Rainier Vista last month, and the process was amazing. From all the training to help me learn how to budget adequately and plan on a monthly basis to the skills we learned putting in our sweat equity hours. This support sets Habitat apart from any other housing service organization. Almost my entire family worked together to complete the 250 sweat equity hours, and it was such a great experience. We worked on our own house, on the Pacific Build site, and even at the Tukwila Habitat store. Each of us learned so much about using tools, painting, installing light fixtures, and my favorite, we wrapped the house in Tyvek, which was kind of hard, but a lot of the skills we learned that will help us in our future. Along the way, Habitat stood by my side, encouraging me, building my confidence that I could actually do this, be a homeowner. What I love the most is that I know this home was built with loving hands of volunteers who pounded in nails, painted walls, fixed floors, and so much more. It was built by companies like Lowe's and Schneider Electric, and it was built by you whose support of Habitat for Humanity made what seemed to be an impossible dream a reality for me and my family. It means that all of our struggles were worthwhile, that our hard work has paid off. I feel like saying thank you just isn't enough. We are deeply privileged to have been chosen to own a Habitat home, and we know it. Even my teenagers know it. You would get a kick out of how protective they are about their rooms and keeping them nice. And this, from teenagers, is pretty amazing. The kindness and generosity of people like you have not only changed our lives, you have changed our lives and changed our values. You've changed our morals. So for now, a simple thank you will have to do. We are blessed and honored by your support. Thank you.
Such a wonderful story to hear, and so important to highlight all the work that Habitat's doing and the community is doing collectively. So let's move on to recovery now. Representative Gregerson, we just wrapped up the slate's legislative session. How did affordable housing fare?
Thank you, Tracey. Affordable housing fared well. We invested over $1 billion in rental assistance. And for those that are not sure about the policy and that actually is with those rental assistance dollars goes directly to the landlords. It doesn't go through the tenant. And again, that's been agreed upon with the business community. So again, that's $1 billion going directly into our economy. We also invested $350 million in affordable housing and emergency shelter in our capital budget. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in helping with the moratorium when the moratorium does end, so that folks have access to legal support systems. And of course, we also invested in the business community that will help with affordable housing, right? $400 million in our childcare, $40 million in healthcare for childcare workers. So I think if you look through the 1,100-page budget document, you'll see a lot there for affordable housing and supporting families where they are to stay in their homes.
Thank you, Representative. Our next question is for Mayor Robinson. You've led Bellevue's COVID-19 response, connecting communities with needed resources and coordinating support for local businesses and services. How can we collectively make a strong case to support the acceleration of affordable housing for low-income families?
Even before COVID, we knew the needs of our community. We knew that more than 50% of our renters were cost burdened, meaning that they're spending over 30% of their income toward their housing. And since COVID, that number has to have gone up. I was so pleased that for our first council meeting we convened, we distributed our council contingency dollars toward human services for the agencies that would do rental assistance, food security, and childcare. And since that time, our council's allocated $2 million at least to the communities that need it the most. Not being cost burden, or I just think, you know, if you look at the whole cycle, having access to affordable housing means that you have a household that can live in a home that they can actually afford. And not being cost burden means that they have money left over at the end of the month. And being able to save money prepares you for an emergency and allows you to increase your financial security. So if we really want to move the needle on equity and housing security and inclusion, I think it begins with having access to housing that you can afford in the city that you want to live in. And in order to do that, we simply have to create more affordable housing throughout the entire region.
Absolutely agree with you. Thank you, Mayor. Let's move on. The next question will be for patients. Thinking about legislation more locally, how can we collectively make a strong case to support the acceleration of affordable housing for low-income families?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Tracey. I think the biggest place to start is to build coalitions that can really speak collectively across areas of interest in supporting affordable housing for low-income families. And that starts with us working from the business sector, from the nonprofit to philanthropy, really coming together with an agenda of supporting more affordable housing. And once we have that strong support across the board, beginning to look at the opportunities that the state just created for local jurisdictions. There's quite a number of other tools that were provided by the state in thinking of how do we increase or incentivize more housing opportunities. We have House Bill 1220, which just passed, and local jurisdictions will be looking at adopting their comprehensive plans in the coming few years, and that's an opportunity to increase more housing choices across all parts of our communities. So looking at implementing tools that have come from the state level is going to be another important next step. There are other tools as well that I can spend the whole day mentioning here because the state just did an amazing job in creating those. But beyond that, I think in looking at the need for affordable housing, we know that we do not have enough funding to support the production of housing that's needed or the scale of housing that's needed. So as we build the coalitions across sectors, really raising funds that can help us increase the supply of homes is going to be one critical area of work that we collectively look at. And then looking at the incentivizing and inclusion of affordable housing, there's so many tools, some that have already been existing prior to 2021 that we created at the state level, whether that's a density bonus that local jurisdiction can be looking at for affordable housing, making those tools more robust as we implement them in our local communities is going to be important. Looking at other tools like inclusionary zoning as an area that we really, as we see job growth and population growth in our communities, we proactively adopt those policies to ensure that we are not only growing the economy, but we're also bringing alongside with us folks who may otherwise not be able to afford to live in some of our communities of opportunity is another one. And then the third one that really comes to mind is the preservation of some of the existing affordable units that we still have in the market. There's may not be a lot of those, but I think it's very important that communities, number one, look at this recession as another opportunity as some of the properties may come online and be available for us to acquire and turn them into affordable housing or into permanent supportive housing long term. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to really be advancing our efforts and our collective voices and accelerating the production and preservation of affordable housing for low-income families.
Patience, thank you. We're moving on now to all the panelists. I'd like to ask you, each of you to identify, and I know if we had all day, I think we could all take the time for it, but to identify the single most important point that you would make about women, recovery, and housing for the coming year. And I know that this is a very large topic, but we would love to hear your perspective and your point of view of how we would love to work together to help in the recovery efforts. So we will start with Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Tracey. That is a big question, and it's difficult to think of one issue. Just coming out of a 105-day session, first woman of color to be in the inner workings of the budget and look at every line item. Language matters, words matter in a budget. Who's prioritized, how those dollars go out. If you have $658 million, where does that go, right? Who gets those dollars? When you're thinking about systems of access to financial institutions, and if you have an I-10 loan, who's in, who's out, how much are you able to get access to? I think for me, it's about the language and just being really more intentional about asking for policy and budgets to include women, communities of color, to ensure that that's when government does their best work, is when they're supporting those that need that help. We know that this is not an anti-business thing. This is all a big circle of being a community, right? Happier workers that can live close to where they work, who can have a place for their children to be safe during the day, or as a silver tsunami comes into King County or Washington State, we're able to keep those folks close to their younger generation so that they have community. And that means building more additional dwelling units and folks that can live close to the communities that they want. I think, and all that can be in the budget. So I guess for me, that's one of the recovery items, is just really being more intentional.
Thank you. And then to you, Mayor Robinson, the same question.
Well, I would say that during this pandemic, I've seen a lot of strong leadership from the women throughout the region. Think about all the local mayors and female legislators at the state and federal level that we have working for us right now. It's pretty incredible. But at the same time, I watch these amazing community women in survival mode, getting the job done to keep themselves and their families safe. I've seen the sacrifice, the determination, and the courage. So my one takeaway is that people deserve safe and stable housing. And it's our job as elected officials and as a community to ensure that there's enough affordable housing stock created to serve our diverse population. If every person in the city attacks this goal, I think we will achieve it.
Patience, sorry.
Well, everything Mayor Robinson said, I would just build and say that I think we've seen such incredible leadership from women across the region throughout this time. And going forward, as we think of recovery, continue to support the leadership of women and working with them in the process of our planning, in the process of our policy creations, whether that's women from the community or that's women in leadership positions, but really centering the voice of people who we know throughout this pandemic have disproportionately been impacted. I think we've covered a lot of the issues that we are seeing on the ground in the ways that women are being impacted. So really having that voice is going to be critical, because we do bring that lived experience that would not be understandable to anyone else who's not had to live through it.
Certainly, yes. And Erica?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a City Hall reporter, and I covered the legislature too, I mean, one thing that that just comes up again and again is that policymakers often struggle to keep multiple ideas in their head at the same time. And I think that, you know, I would like to see policymakers just really, you know, working on more than one thing at a time. Too often, you know, it just gets forgotten that women face unique challenges that are specifically related to gender and gender roles. And while, you know, we're focusing, I mean, as a city in Seattle, we tend to sort of run from one crisis to another and one crisis issue to another, whether it's the West Seattle Bridge or, you know, it's homelessness or a specific aspect of homelessness that is in the news, you know, that week or that month. That makes for sort of disjointed policy and policy making. And so, you know, I think that something to just always keep in mind is, you know, there are always going to be specific issues that relate to women and to people of color, and, you know, and to other identities as well. But that, you know, it needs to be possible to keep all of that in your mind at one time while you're dealing with the crisis of the week.
Thank you, Erica. And Laura?
Recovery has to include economic recovery. And my invitation is that while not every one of us is sitting in a place where we can close the gender pay gap, we do have the opportunity, each of us, to put our thumb on the scales of economic justice and close the revenue gap for women-owned businesses. We have to remember that a lot of a little is a lot. And for example, if we were able to shift $10 a month from larger corporations to supporting small businesses, right? And we just think about the folks in Washington State who are one of the 3 Americans who already participate in Small Business Saturday, right? Collectively, we could shift over $300 million in support of the diverse small businesses at the heart of our communities.
Certainly, it is very clear that there is a lot that we need to do to get back to a new normal. But it is great to hear from all of you, from the business angle to communities, and how individuals can come together to help. We would like to move on now to our Q&A section. I believe we have time for 3 questions. We can go ahead and look in the Q&A. And this will be open to any of the panelists that want to answer them. What relief is there currently for landlords who've been unable to evict tenants who are not paying rent? And is there property tax relief or other programs to help them? Many are small-time landlords and need the rental income to pay their mortgages, maintain the property, and pay their property taxes. Oh, yes, Representative.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's something that has to happen at the state level. So.
Yeah, and I did try to thread an answer that was similar to help with that question. And that is that $1 billion that I talked about is directly going to landlords. Sometimes folks think it goes to the renters, but it actually goes directly to the landlords. And that's an equation that's been discussed and agreed upon by the landlords. And that includes small landlords, not just large ones that own large properties. And then again, once the eviction moratorium ends, there will be resources so that both landlords and the community, the tenant, have access to legal support to ensure that fairness is had and folks can either stay in their home or continue to work through those complicated decisions. And I do believe, I apologize, I don't have it memorized, what types of forgiveness has happened in regards to tax forgiveness. But I do know that there were efforts. Maybe someone here on this panel actually knows.
Thank you, Representative. We can, there's another question we can also move on to. How can we get better policies in place for the construction of accessory dwelling units? And would affordable housing or affordable quality housing in communities with good school districts also be included? How could that happen as well?
I'm happy to say that a little bit. First of all, I don't believe accessory dwelling units is the answer to our affordable housing crisis. It might fill a small need. I think it's really what we need to do is look at our policy, our incentives, and how do we create every development that we make in our city? How do we create affordable housing units? How do we make policies that incentivize our developers to want to do that? And if you've been following the Bellevue City Council at all in the last month, we're making huge steps towards revamping our affordable housing incentives, expanding our use of incentives to any area that allows multifamily dwellings, and so expanding incentive program to all frequency route areas and not just the downtown and the bed. So Bellevue has a wonderful school district. The more kids that are able to access it, the more, you know, success we're going to have in our community. So I am all for making it more possible for families to live in our city. And I think that it's got to start with policies that actually work.
I think I just want to add, when it comes to accessory dwelling units, I agree. I mean, that's never going to be a huge part of the affordable housing solution. But I think one of the reasons that, particularly in Seattle, one of the reasons that our housing is so unaffordable is that we have a lot of areas where multifamily housing of any kind is banned. And accessory dwelling units are sort of the gentlest type of multifamily housing that you can get. It's just, you know, like a backyard cottage that a homeowner builds. And last session, the legislature considered, didn't end up ultimately passing a proposal that would have banned some of the requirements that cities put on ADUs, like owner occupancy requirements, where you can't, where the owner has to be there. You know, the house and the unit can't both be rented out to renters. And, you know, for single family areas, I mean, here in Seattle, the median house is, you know, I don't even know what it is now, but something along the, you know, the lines of $700,000, $800,000. to be able to be in those neighborhoods is, just beyond the reach of most renters, and renters with kids as well who may want to be near some of those schools. So maybe it starts with ADUs, and then it expands to getting rid of some of the bans on renters that exist in a lot of areas in Seattle and other cities as well.
Erica, I'm just going to add something that I never hear people talk about, and that's housing circulation. So in Bellevue, half the housing is single family homes with an average of 4 bedrooms, and half of the people that live in those single family homes are 1 or 2 adults without children. So we have all these empty nesters kind of hogging the single family home block. And if we could focus a little bit on creating housing for people to downsize to that helps them stay in the neighborhood, that's another pitch for ADUs, or for townhouses on the perimeters of our neighborhoods. Or that's a conversation we never have. And I think that if we had a little more housing circulation, we'd have at least a little more single family home stock.
Yeah, I think as someone who's been working on additional dwelling unit policy for quite a while now, these are all concerns and hopes and dreams that we hear throughout the state. The reality is that families want to come together, stay together. They can't necessarily afford to sell their home and move somewhere else. Like, there's a lot of restrictions when it comes to actually being able to circulate the home and then buy into something else that's affordable. People are living longer. And again, I come from the suburbs of King County, where properties are still large. I live on a 10,000 square foot property. My mom and her husband live upstairs from me. If we could have another dwelling unit, we could keep the property longer as property taxes go up, right? Like, we know communities of color want to be able to buy these properties when they come open, and they can't purchase it alone. And so these are ways that if we can bring down the cost to build an additional dwelling unit, or an attached dwelling unit, or condoize, or build townhouses, fourplexes on these properties, this is a game changer. And I think the concern is that we're in the middle of a housing crisis. We're in the middle of a housing shortage. We have to start somewhere. And these are places where people own the property. We should be able to reduce some of those barriers, parking that's required, height restrictions. Some of these things I think are doable.
Thank you. The third question that we had come in, what is the best way to support Habitat? Is it just donations or working on site, or are there messages that we can try to spread in our communities that would be really helpful?
This is to support the amazing work of Habitat.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would chime in just as someone who works closely with Habitat, and as having Habitat as a wonderful member. I think it's beyond donations, it's the volunteering, it's thinking of ways that we can innovatively increase payment assistance programs that can really help the homeowners have access to home ownership opportunities. And beyond that work, I think what's important is how do we take that volunteer commitment and also bring it to the policy side and program side, because they can be value in having all these critical voices really help individual people, but how do we advance systemic change work? And that's the opportunity that we have with the presence of Habitat in South King County and across Washington State. I know they've done a lot of amazing work in getting us to a point at the state level. I'm well aware that there was a budget proviso that will have a group looking at the home ownership disparities across the state. That's work that our communities can continue to support. And of course, the policies that we just discussed here are some other areas that we can also be partnering with Habitat in moving that work forward. And I do see that the Habitat website was just posted. I also wanted to chime in on the accessory dwelling units conversation, which is a little bit late now, but did want to say, of course, accessory dwelling units are not always the de facto affordability solution, but they are a key tool to the toolbox as well. It's an additional tool that we can have to gently increase housing choices in these neighborhoods that, number one, disproportionately single family zone areas. And at the same time, you also have, of course, older people or elderly people who are interested in downsizing. And that's a very good, easy way to be able to age in place. You're aging within your own house, with your own family, can also become a multi-generational living situation that families can be able to find themselves in. But I think to the question of how do we advocate for those, it's important that as local jurisdictions are considering accessory dwelling units policies, we are looking at what are some of the restrictive additions that are being added. I think Erica did an amazing job of just giving a highlight of some of those restrictions in terms of the parking requirements that can come with accessory dwelling units, in terms of the owner occupancy that can come with it as well. And Representative Mayor Gregerson has been doing a lot of work at the state level. So let's continue to organize not only at the local level, but support the state work alongside our local jurisdictions adopting some of those policies.
Patience, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our entire panel for your very thoughtful answers. This was such an amazing discussion, and I feel that we could probably extend this for hours, but of course, we want to be considerate of everyone's time. And we do appreciate everyone for coming here and for joining us today. I've truly enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure our audience did as well. And to our panelists, again, we want to thank you for serving on our panel. Your willingness to share your time, your passion, and expertise were critical to the success of this event. So thank you to each one of you. And I also want to thank everyone for supporting the 2021 Women Build Week and Habitat for Humanity, Seattle, King County. Habitat can't do this vital work without your investment of time or financial support. Find out how you can get involved and learn more at www.habitat.skc.org. There is still time to volunteer for Women Build Week. And of course, you can always go to the website and donate anytime. We appreciate that. And thank you everyone again for your time today. Again, have a great rest of your day. And if you need anything, of course, this recording will also be put on the website. And if you have any additional questions, you can also email Habitat and we will get back to you.